marketed, and they offer this interesting technological possibility. You've always wanted to go out with Mel Gibson or, let me make sure I don't commit a gender crime so I'll get everyone in. Mel Gibson or Kathleen Turner or any combination of men, women, animals, and or whatever necessary in order to avoid committing a sexist crime, gender crime up here. Whatever combination you imagine, since under these conditions of virtual reality, whatever transgressive gender you have, you'll be able to live it out perfectly in a perfectly commodified way with a virtual reality suit anyway. Well, you want to go out with Kathleen Turner, you just plug in and press the body heat module, and then the next thing you know, you're right in the screenplay. William Hurt's out, you're in. She walks at the door, it's all great. Now that's a product we'll want to buy. Many of us. A product we'll want to buy. The problem with this advancing culture is that that is buying, just like in an earlier period of capital, when you bought the wage labor of someone to do the work for you. Now what we're buying are instruments and equipments that do the experiencing for us. That was a part of my critique of all these instant therapies, is to buy a life story for yourself immediately that can be swallowed painlessly, you know. And when you buy a virtual reality suit, or what I call virtual reality eyes, which is television, and when you look at virtual reality, it provides you a prepackaged experience, one that is already coded for you. In other words, designed with your mind in mind. Now, if you want another way to check out this new emerging terrain, this nihilism realized, what you might call Nietzsche's nightmare squared. Okay? If you want to look at this, you might look at what advertisements go with what normal channel TV programming. So, for example, if you have the Cosby Show, you'll have advertising for upscale African-American families mixed with the younger, yuppie audience that it draws. 30-something, which is now off, mercifully. Hope I can say that without getting sued, because I'm sorry, I watched it, but I got the whining. The whining got to me. Sorry, yeah, they're just whining. But in any case, the advertisements followed the story very closely. You know, you'd have a little moment when one of the characters would sort of wistfully stop whining and look around, and then the next thing you know, there'd be an ad for an infinity car. Sort of answers that need to overcome the wistful desire. Well, I'm wistful and I've whined, but if I was in my infinity, an infinity of automobiles, well, that's not just a way to get around now, is it? You see, commodities are no longer just things of use. They've become part of what we are. And we need to recognize it. I mean, that's one of the lessons that I'm trying to drive home here today, is that if there will be battles over this new terrain and on it, many of them will be fought on the terrain itself. Television, radio, magazines, as I've called it, the obscenity of the saturated communicational culture, saturated with information, obscenely oversaturated, information up to your neck, beyond your elbows. Now, of course, I could be wrong about all this. Let me just stop and say that for a moment. This postmodern trajectory, I think, hasn't yet fully realized itself, and I could be wrong about the direction in which we're moving, and perhaps Nietzsche's nightmare won't come true. I don't know. I know that none of us is beyond surprising. I'm not a dogmatist. Really, I'm not. None of us are beyond surprising. For that, we're just not capable of so perfect an irony. And yet none of us are capable of refusing to subject our occasional surprises to further analysis. For that, we are not nearly simple enough. So I could be wrong. I could be wrong. And whether I am or not, though, this is the nice part about an argument like this, whether I am or not, time will tell, except that Here, if it tells one thing, it won't have mattered, as you may have guessed, since it won't have told it to anyone. If I'm right, my argument has the peculiar characteristic that it will not have mattered. It will only have mattered if what I've said turns out to be wrong in ways that my argument has affected. Now I want to return back off from that current moment, the trajectory of the postmodern, back to Nietzsche for a second. Since we're trying to end Nietzsche, and yet I see how impossible that is now. Perhaps we won't be through with the reading of Nietzsche. Perhaps even once the world has been fully turned into replicants, skin jobs, replicants, robotics, cybernetics, maybe then they will have a certain class of them programmed to interpret Nietzsche in ways yet unthinkable, right? Who knows? That certainly, why not? Well, now I want to defend my general kind of descriptive procedure here briefly. One of the things that philosophers do as part of an anxiety complex is to try to prove they weren't wrong, so I'm going to do that very briefly. And I'm going to do it here by aligning myself with Nietzsche for at least a moment again, pulling back from the horror that I don't know if it's horror. Some postmodern theorists view it as ecstasy. At a certain level of pain and strangeness, it's difficult to distinguish the two anyway. That may be a remark only about my personal pathologies. I'm not sure. But in any case, Bertrand Russell once said, and I don't remember where, but it was an irritation over philosophers who cannot be refuted according to the normal rules of truth and falsity and the empirical verification of their propositions and so on. It was a very irritating thing to him. He named, among others, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and so on. And he thought that they were connected in some deep sense to the growth of unreason in the 19th and 20th century, which, from my view of history, is to get things backwards. I've always thought that this strange paleo-conservative desire to blame intellectuals for things is odd. We talk about the Enlightenment, loosely in universities, as though 4 pedants could make an age of the world. You notice I haven't given an analysis of the Enlightenment, but of modernity, of modernization, of the advance of capital, because 4 pedants don't make an age. And 2 or 3 weird philosophers don't give birth to a century of unreason. Nietzsche didn't, from his drawing room give birth to a century of cannonade, slaughter, concentration camps, CIA subterfuge, raping and the murdering of nuns, the bombing of continents, the despoiling of beaches, and the ruining of a planet. 4 or 5 pedants do not have that much power, and never have. That's just a sort of bugbear. They didn't unleash unreason on the world. Jeez, how crazy can some people get? Even in the postmodern world, you shouldn't be that crazy to think 3 or 4 pedants invented this stuff. And don't think when I talk about the postmodern condition that 3 or 4 pedants invented that description. What makes these descriptions necessary is what goes on all around us and in our daily lives as we begin to feel distant from ourselves in bizarre ways. Nevertheless, Russell said, well, look, this unreasonable approach, he thought was connected to Hume's, as I've mentioned Hume before, to Hume's destruction of empiricism. What do you mean? Hume destroying the self and various other rational accounts. Russell thought the horrible consequence that followed from the multiplicity of interpretations, the many ways in which we can deploy the word truth, the shifting contexts in which we can interpret, the many narratives that we can tell, he thought the horrible consequence that followed from that was unreason. And by the way, I do like Russell in many respects, don't get me wrong, especially Russell as a person, much more interesting person than Nietzsche as a person, certainly had better politics as a person. But on this point, I disagree with Russell. Russell says, look, if there is no intellectual difference between sanity and insanity, he gets this extreme with it. Now, Russell usually doesn't talk that extremely. If there's no